A golden ticket was not found in a chocolate bar. It was bought with a multimillion-dollar dowry. This is the scandalous, hidden world of the Wall Street wife advantage. In the Gilded Age, America's richest daughters traded staggering fortunes for something their money could not buy: aristocratic titles and social power. By the end of this story, you will understand the breathtaking strategy behind the most exclusive merger in history, where marriage was a business deal that reshaped nations. What was the real price of a crown? And could a bride purchased for her fortune ever become the true power behind a throne? When you think of trading everything for status, where would you draw the line? These young women were walking contradictions of their time. They were raised in marble palaces with ballrooms larger than city blocks, yet they were considered social outsiders in the very country their fathers had built. Their fortunes came from railroads, steel, and oil, industries that defined modern America. But to the old money elite of New York and Boston, they were simply new money, a label spoken with a quiet, dismissive sneer. The daughters of Vanderbilt, Astor, and Carnegie possessed everything tangible, yet they were denied the intangible: respect, history, a place in the social firmament that felt permanent. This created a powerful, almost desperate yearning. Their fathers had conquered the American economy, but for their daughters, the final frontier was a 500-year-old bloodline across the ocean. A European title offered instant purification, a way to launder new wealth through ancient lineage. It was the ultimate revenge on a New York society that had snubbed them, and it set the stage for a market as calculated as any stock exchange. Wealthy American fathers began to see their daughters not merely as children to be married off, but as strategic assets, the perfect currency for a very specific kind of purchase. Across the Atlantic, the other half of this equation was living a very different kind of fairy tale, one that was falling apart. While the American heiress felt imprisoned by her fortune, the European aristocrat was being slowly crushed by his history. Imagine inheriting not just a title, but a 500-year-old stone castle with a leaking roof. Picture a duke who owns 10,000 acres of land but cannot afford to heat more than 3 rooms of his ancestral home. These men possessed the one thing the American magnates craved: an unassailable social position, a lineage that could be traced back to kings and crusaders. But they were, in the bluntest terms, bankrupt. The Industrial Revolution had shifted wealth away from land and into factories, railroads, and steel mills, industries their aristocratic pride often prevented them from touching. Their vast estates were not assets. They were financial sinkholes, consuming fortunes in upkeep, staff wages, and taxes. The lifestyle demanded by their station, the grand hunts, the season in London, the maintenance of a proper household, was bleeding them dry. A duke might be invited to every important event in the country, yet he could not pay the butcher's bill. This created a desperation that was the perfect mirror to the American social climber's ambition. For the nobleman, a wealthy bride was not a romantic partner. She was a rescue package. Her dowry was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It could repair the castle roof, restore the family art collection, pay off the mountainous debts, and secure the estate for another generation. In this stark calculus, love was a secondary concern, often a distant third. The transaction was clear: her cash for his coronet. It was a merger that saved both parties from their respective forms of ruin. The American girl escaped the gilded cage of new money obscurity, and the European lord preserved the ancient stone cage of his family legacy. Each believed they were getting the better end of the deal, but the true balance of power in such a union was never guaranteed. This mass migration of wealth and women earned a name that captured its entire essence: the dollar princess. The term was a perfect paradox, a label that was both a fact and an insult. On the surface, it simply described a young American woman with an immense fortune who married into European nobility. But the way it was said, with a hint of mockery, revealed everything. It whispered that her title was purchased, not inherited, that her place in a castle was funded by pork packing or railroad stocks, not ancient lineage. She was a princess, yes, but one whose crown was minted in dollars. Hundreds of these women made the journey in the final decades of the 19th century and into the 20th. A steady stream of silk, steel, and securities sailing east. Their impact was staggering. They did not just marry into the British peerage and other European houses. They rebuilt them from the inside out. Think of it as the most exclusive, high-stakes gene therapy in history. They infused centuries-old bloodlines with new capital, and quite literally, new blood. The genetic makeup of the aristocracy changed as American daughters became the mothers and grandmothers of future dukes and earls. More immediately, their dowries repaired crumbling estates, replenished emptied coffers, and restored art collections that had been sold off to pay debts. A single marriage could rescue a family from obscurity and secure its legacy for another 100 years. The transaction was so effective, it became a trend, then a social phenomenon, and finally a quiet revolution. The old world was preserved, but it was preserved with New World money, creating a hybrid aristocracy that was financially robust, but forever carried the slight, the elegant reminder that its salvation had a price tag. Behind every great transaction stands a broker, and these marriages were no exception. The market for titles required expert negotiators, individuals who understood the precise value of a bloodline and could haggle over a dowry with the cold calculation of a commodities trader. Often, the most formidable broker was the bride's own mother. Take Alva Vanderbilt, a woman whose ambition was as vast as the fortune she married into. After conquering New York society by building a palace and throwing the most extravagant ball of the Gilded Age, she set her sights on a higher prize for her daughter, Consuelo. Alva was not looking for a suitable young man. She was engineering a geopolitical alliance. She targeted the highest echelon available, the British aristocracy, and specifically, the Duke of Marlborough. The negotiations were brutal and utterly devoid of sentiment. Alva reportedly secured the deal by locking her weeping daughter in her room until she consented to the marriage. The dowry was astronomical, rumored to be in the millions, and it came with a critical clause: an annual allowance so large it would ensure the Vanderbilt wealth directly controlled the upkeep of Blenheim Palace, the Duke's colossal estate. This was not a mother's gentle guidance. It was a corporate takeover, with a teenage girl as the principal asset. When a mother's network was insufficient, the family turned to professionals. A specialized class of matchmakers emerged, socialites with connections on both sides of the Atlantic, who operated with the discretion and efficiency of modern investment bankers. These women, and sometimes men, possessed little black books that listed every eligible but impoverished nobleman in Europe and every wealthy American heiress desperate for a title. They were masters of intelligence, knowing which duke was on the verge of losing his estate to creditors, which railroad heiress was being snubbed at the New York Opera, and how to bring them together. Their fees were substantial, but their value was in their precision. They brokered the details with a lawyer's eye, negotiating the exact sum of the dowry, the breakdown of the allowance, the specific jewels and properties to be included, and even the social obligations the new bride would be expected to fulfill. They understood that they were not just arranging a marriage, they were executing a merger. The contract had to ensure the capital infusion was sufficient to save the aristocratic house, while providing the American family with the unassailable social position they bought. In the glittering ballrooms and private drawing rooms, these brokers traded in human futures, building bridges of gold and desperation across an ocean. Their work guaranteed the system operated smoothly, turning romantic destiny into a predictable and highly profitable business arrangement. The dowry was not a sentimental gift. It was the cornerstone of the entire contract. These were not modest sums tucked inside a wedding card. They were corporate-scale financial injections, often running into the millions of dollars at a time when $1 million was an almost unimaginable fortune. To grasp the scale, consider that a single dowry in the 1890s could be equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's money. This was capital meant not just to decorate a new home, but to rebuild a crumbling empire. The money was paid directly to the groom or his family, a transaction as formal and binding as any stock purchase. Its purpose was explicit: to bail out the indebted estate, to pay off creditors who were circling like vultures, and to fund the lavish renovations that would restore a historic property to its former glory. In this light, the marriage ceremony was merely the signing of the deal, the public celebration of a private financial rescue. Take the marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt to the Duke of Marlborough. Her dowry was reported to be a staggering $2.5 million in cash, with another $100,000 a year in allowance. That immediate cash infusion, worth well over $70 million today, was what saved the magnificent Blenheim Palace from decay and secured the Marlborough lineage. The palace got a new roof, updated plumbing, and restored gardens, while the Vanderbilt family secured a dukedom. Every stone repointed, every tapestry restored, was a direct result of that dowry. This financial reality stripped away any pretense of romance. The negotiations were detailed and brutal, covering everything from the bride's personal annual allowance, her clothing budget, to the specific number of carriages and horses she would be entitled to use. Lawyers pored over the documents, ensuring the American family's investment was protected. The bride, in essence, became the chief financial officer of her own life and the savior of her husband's ancestral home. Her value was quantified, transferred, and spent. This was not a union of hearts, but a merger of balance sheets, where love was a distant, secondary consideration to solvency and social strategy. What did it feel like to know your entire worth, your identity in this new world, was predetermined by a number in a bank ledger? Consuelo Vanderbilt's wedding day was one of the most spectacularly miserable in history. The ceremony at St. Thomas Church in New York City, on a cold November day in 1895, was a spectacle of pure Gilded Age excess. Crowds gathered outside to glimpse the 18-year-old bride, her face veiled by yards of priceless lace, her gown a masterpiece of silk and pearls. Yet beneath that veil, she was weeping. She had been forced to break off her engagement to a man she truly loved, a suitable American suitor, and was instead being marched down the aisle to marry a man she barely knew, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Her mother, Alva, had engineered every moment of this transaction. She had reportedly locked Consuelo in her room, threatened her, and even claimed she would have a heart attack and die if her daughter did not obey. The Duke, for his part, was a cold and distant figure, motivated by one overwhelming fact. His family seat, the monumental Blenheim Palace, was financially sinking. The marriage was not a romantic union, it was a corporate bailout. Consuelo's dowry, a staggering $2.5 million in cash, was the life raft. That immediate infusion of capital, equivalent to well over $70 million today, stopped the financial bleeding. It paid off the palace's immense debts, funded critical repairs to the leaking roof and aging structure, and restored the vast grounds. In a single transaction, the Marlborough title was saved from ruin, and the Vanderbilt name was etched permanently into the British peerage. The personal cost, however, was immense. Consuelo entered a lonely and rigid life at Blenheim, a palace with over 200 rooms that felt like a gilded prison. Her husband was often absent or openly unfaithful, and she was expected to produce an heir, which she did, but little more. She was a dollar princess in the most literal sense, a beautifully dressed financial instrument, her happiness sacrificed on the altar of social strategy and architectural preservation. Her story became the ultimate cautionary tale of the Wall Street wife advantage, a stark reminder that the glittering crown could feel unbearably heavy. What does it mean to save a centuries-old legacy when the price is a young woman's entire future? The social payoff for the heiress and her family was immediate and absolute. Overnight, the Vanderbilts, the Golets, the Jeromes ceased to be merely wealthy American industrialists. They were now the in-laws of dukes, the mothers of future earls, the financial architects behind some of Europe's most storied houses. This was not a gradual social climb, it was a quantum leap. The most coveted doors, ones that had been firmly shut in New York and Newport, now swung open as if by magic. For the bride herself, the transformation was most personal. One day, she was Miss Jenny Jerome of New York, a girl with a lively mind and a substantial fortune. The next, she was Lady Randolph Churchill, a name that carried the weight of centuries, granting her an automatic seat at the very heart of British political and social life. She gained entry to drawing rooms and courts that were the epicenters of global power, spaces where her father's money, no matter how vast, could never have purchased a genuine invitation. The prestige did not stop with the bride. It cascaded through her entire family, a rising tide of social capital that lifted all relatives. Her brothers and male cousins found their way smoothed into diplomatic posts, prestigious clubs, and lucrative business introductions on the strength of their new aristocratic connections. A father who had been sneered at as a railroad baron was now respectfully addressed as the father-in-law of a marquess. The family name once synonymous only with new wealth, was now intertwined with history itself. This was the ultimate validation, the final and unanswerable rebuttal to every social slight they had ever endured back home. It proved that their money was not just powerful, it was transformative. It could buy the one thing that had eluded them, a permanent, unassailable place in the hierarchy of the world. The crown, or the coronet, was the final piece of the puzzle, the glittering seal that certified their arrival. But this new title came with a rigid script and a world of unspoken rules. How did a young American woman, raised with relative freedom and directness, navigate the labyrinth of traditions and expectations in a centuries-old castle? The sheer scale of the financial rescue was breathtaking. A single Wall Street wife's dowry could accomplish what generations of aristocratic management had failed to do: stabilize a teetering empire. This was not merely supplemental income, it was a complete economic overhaul, delivered in one lump sum. The money flowed directly into the crumbling foundations of history. At Blenheim Palace, Consuelo Vanderbilt's millions did not just repair the roof. They funded a full-scale restoration of the grand staterooms, updated the antiquated heating and plumbing systems for hundreds of rooms, and revived the legendary gardens that had fallen into neglect. Her fortune literally rewired and replumbed a national monument, ensuring it could survive another century. For other estates, the American dowry was a shield against a changing world. The late 19th century saw a profound agricultural depression across Britain and Europe. The income from vast ancestral farmlands, which for centuries had supported noble families, plummeted. Suddenly, those 10,000 acres were a liability, not an asset, costing more to maintain than they produced in rent. Enter the American heiress. Her capital paid the property taxes, covered the wages for armies of gardeners, gamekeepers, and household staff, and allowed the estate to keep its lands intact instead of selling them off piecemeal to developers. The fortune acted as an emergency endowment, insulating the aristocratic family from the harsh, new realities of the industrial economy. Perhaps most crucially, it paid off the mountain of debt. Many of these families were not just cash poor. They were leveraged to the brink, with mortgages on their land and loans against their art collections. The dowry cleared the ledgers in one stroke. It redeemed heirlooms from pawnbrokers, settled accounts with merchants who had been waiting years for payment, and freed the title from the shadow of the bank. This financial liberation meant the family could continue its traditional lifestyle: the seasonal moves to London, the elaborate hunts, the charitable patronage, all the performative aspects of nobility that required significant capital. In essence, the Wall Street wife did not just marry a man, she adopted his entire ancestral burden. Her money became the life support system for a way of life that was otherwise economically extinct. She purchased the continuation of a fairy tale, but the receipts were kept in a very modern ledger. This exchange preserved history, but it also created a profound and unspoken dependency. What happens when the financial savior is also a stranger in a gilded cage, expected to fund a world she does not fully understand or control? But the story does not end with a bank transfer and a repaired roof. A far more subtle and powerful advantage emerged once the Wall Street wife was installed in her new home. Beyond the title and the castle, she possessed a tool more potent than her dowry: her independent wealth, and her American mindset. This gave her a unique form of power, the power of patronage and influence. As the chatelaine, the mistress of a great house, she was suddenly at the helm of a cultural and social institution. She controlled the household budget, decided which charities received support, and most importantly, set the tone for who was invited into the drawing room. This allowed her to become a serious patron of the arts. An American heiress could champion artists, composers, and writers who were struggling or avant-garde, using her fortune and her social position to give them a platform. She might commission portraits, fund exhibitions, or underwrite musical performances, directly shaping the cultural landscape in ways her husband, bound by tradition, might never consider. Her taste, often more modern and eclectic, began to infiltrate the very fabric of aristocratic life, blending American boldness with European tradition. The drawing room itself became her stage for a different kind of theater, the political salon. In an era before women could vote or hold office, these gatherings were a primary avenue for female influence. A skilled hostess like Lady Randolph Churchill, born Jenny Jerome, could bring together prime ministers, foreign ambassadors, journalists, and intellectuals under one roof. Over dinner and conversation, ideas were exchanged, policies were debated, and alliances were gently forged. A well-placed word from the hostess, a carefully curated guest list, or simply the creation of a neutral space for opposing figures to meet could have a tangible impact on political discourse and even diplomatic relations. This was soft power in its most elegant form. The heiress, with her new title granting access and her American fortune ensuring independence, was not a silent ornament. She was a conductor, orchestrating the social symphony that often played the overture to real political action. She could use her resources to support causes she believed in, from public health initiatives to educational reforms, leveraging her name to attract attention and funding. In this role, she was no longer just a rescue fund for a castle. She was an active force, shaping the culture and politics of her adopted country from a position of unique privilege and autonomy. The crown came with a platform, and the smartest of these women learned to use it. Yet this financial lifeline came with its own legal armor, a document as cold and calculating as the marriage itself. Known as the marriage settlement, it was the Gilded Age prenuptial agreement, a complex legal fortress built around the heiress's fortune. Its primary purpose was stark: to prevent the very man she was marrying from completely devouring her wealth. While the dowry was handed over to rescue the estate, the marriage settlement ensured that the core capital, often the bulk of her inheritance, remained locked away in a trust. This trust was controlled not by her husband, but by trustees, usually her male relatives or family lawyers back in New York. The income from this trust, a generous annual allowance, would be paid to her for her personal use, covering everything from her legendary wardrobe to her charitable donations. Crucially, the principal, the massive fortune itself, was legally designated to pass directly to her children upon her death, bypassing her husband entirely. This was a breathtakingly shrewd safeguard. It acknowledged the brutal reality of the transaction, that the titled husband might see his wife first as a bank account. The settlement ensured that even if he gambled away his own restored income or made another catastrophic financial mistake. The American family's foundational wealth would remain intact, flowing securely to the next generation. For example, in many such settlements, the heiress's jewels, often worth a king's ransom, were legally specified as her separate property, to be inherited by her daughters, not absorbed into the general assets of the estate. This legal instrument turned the bride into a sort of permanent financial ambassador for her birth family, her body in the castle, but her fortune remaining on a very tight, very guarded leash from home. It was a clear-eyed admission that love was not the foundation of this union, but that capital needed protection, even from the very title it was purchased to save. The marriage settlement whispered a truth the wedding vows never mentioned. In this merger of blood and bullion, the money had its own survival strategy. But the glittering title often concealed a profound and private emptiness. For every dollar princess who mastered the art of soft power, many more found themselves utterly isolated in a world they could not escape. Imagine the sheer cultural whiplash. A young woman raised in the vibrant, relatively freewheeling atmosphere of New York or Newport, where conversation was direct and ambition was celebrated, suddenly found herself the mistress of a centuries-old English estate. The rules were unspoken but ironclad. Every aspect of her day, from the order of her wardrobe changes to the precise hour she took tea, was governed by tradition. Her American accent, her forthright opinions, even her energetic demeanor, could be seen as gauche or threatening to a rigid social order. She was expected to assimilate completely, to become a living ornament of a culture she had only ever read about in novels. The result was a deep, aching loneliness. She was an ocean away from her family and friends, surrounded by servants who observed strict hierarchies, and by a husband who had married her for a ledger entry, not companionship. Letters from home took weeks to arrive, and the transatlantic voyage was a major undertaking. She was, in the truest sense, a stranger in a strange land, and her palace walls could feel more like those of a very well-appointed prison. This loneliness was compounded by the widespread expectation of marital neglect and accepted infidelity. The transaction was complete the moment the dowry cleared. For the aristocratic husband, his duty was often seen as fulfilled by providing a title and producing an heir. Once a male child was born to secure the lineage, his interest in his wife could cool dramatically. He would frequently retreat to his own pursuits, whether managing the estate, politics, or the all-male world of his club. Emotional intimacy was rarely part of the bargain. Furthermore, it was an open secret in these circles that noblemen often maintained mistresses. This was not viewed as a scandal, but as a conventional, if discreet, part of aristocratic life. The wife was expected to tolerate it, to look the other way, and to maintain the public facade of a harmonious marriage. For a woman raised with perhaps more romantic expectations, or simply with a desire for respect, this was a devastating betrayal. She had traded her youth, her freedom, and her fortune for a crown, only to be left in a silent, opulent hallway while her husband's real life happened elsewhere. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough, famously described her marriage as a life sentence, endured in splendid isolation. Her husband was openly unfaithful, and they lived largely separate lives under the same massive roof. Her primary role was ceremonial, a beautiful, funded symbol of the estate's solvency. The emotional price of the Wall Street wife advantage, therefore, was staggeringly high. These women gained a title and social supremacy, but they frequently lost their autonomy, their connection to home, and any hope for a loving partnership. They were trapped in a gilded cage of their own family's making. The strategic merger saved castles and elevated names, but it often broke hearts and spirits. This leads us to a haunting question, one that echoes through the grand, empty ballrooms of history. Was the advantage ever truly worth it for the woman who had to live it? Could any amount of social prestige ever compensate for a lifetime of quiet despair? The story of Jenny Jerome shatters the lonely Duchess archetype. She was not a passive financial instrument, but a force of nature who used her Wall Street wife advantage to shape history itself. The daughter of a charismatic New York financier, Leonard Jerome, Jenny was raised in a world of opera boxes, fast horses, and intellectual ferment. She was brilliant, beautiful, and possessed a confidence that was distinctly American. At a yacht regatta in the summer of 1873, she met Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough. He was ambitious, clever, and politically hungry, but as a second son, his prospects were limited. Their whirlwind romance and marriage within days was a classic transaction, her father's fortune supporting his political ambitions. But Jenny brought infinitely more than a checkbook. She brought a new kind of energy into the staid corridors of British power. While her dowry helped fund Lord Randolph's political career, her true contribution was her dynamism and her salon. Jenny Jerome Churchill became one of London's most celebrated hostesses, but her drawing room was not merely a social venue. It was a political engine. She mastered the art of the salon, gathering the most brilliant minds of the era, politicians, writers, artists, and diplomats, and facilitating conversations that moved the levers of power. Her American directness and lack of aristocratic pretension allowed her to bridge factions and foster ideas in a way a more traditional British hostess might not. She was, in effect, her husband's most vital political strategist and ambassador, using her charm and intelligence to build alliances and smooth his often contentious path. Her influence was so palpable that contemporaries whispered Lord Randolph's rapid rise within the Conservative Party was as much due to Jenny's drawing room as to his speeches in Parliament. This American energy did not just influence politics. It shaped a dynasty in the most direct way possible. Her first son, born just 7 months after her wedding, was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. From his earliest days, Winston was immersed in the world his mother created. He witnessed the political maneuvering, heard the debates, and absorbed the sense of destiny that filled their home. While his relationship with his parents was complex and often distant, the environment Jenny cultivated was foundational. She provided not just his famous American heritage, but a living example of political engagement, courage, and relentless spirit. Later in life, Winston would rely on his mother's vast network of contacts and her savvy advice. Jenny Jerome, the Wall Street wife, became the mother and, in many ways, the political godmother to the man who would later defy the Nazi war machine and save Western democracy. Her legacy demonstrates the profound, multi-generational impact of these unions. It was not just about saving an estate. It was about infusing an old bloodline with a new world's vitality, ambition, and resilience. The dowry bought a title, but Jenny's character helped produce a prime minister. Her story forces us to ask, what is the true measure of a merger's success? The immediate financial rescue, or the world-altering legacy that grows from it generations later? Beyond politics and finance, the Wall Street wife's most visible power was worn on her back. These women became the ultimate transatlantic-style icons, their wardrobes acting as a silent, spectacular language that spoke of merging worlds. They arrived in Europe not with the subdued, conservative gowns of the established aristocracy, but with trunks filled with the latest, most daring creations from Parisian couturiers like Charles Frederick Worth, often paid for with their own independent allowances. Their style was a declaration. It was opulent, innovative, and unapologetically modern. At a time when European court dress could be rigidly traditional, an American duchess might appear in a gown of shocking pink silk, embroidered with real pearls and worn with a breathtaking parure of diamonds, a look that announced both her wealth and her freedom from stifling convention. They popularized simpler, more practical day wear for country life, introducing tailored skirts and jackets that allowed for movement, a subtle nod to American informality that gradually loosened the stays of European fashion. But their influence flowed both ways across the ocean. While they brought Parisian glamour to English country houses, they also absorbed and repatriated European elegance. After a season in London, a dollar princess would return to Newport or New York with a new grace, a mastery of formal etiquette, and a refined taste in art and decoration that she had acquired in the great houses of Europe. She might now host a dinner with the precise seating rituals of a British peeress, or design her new mansion with the paneled libraries and portrait galleries she admired in ancestral homes. In this way, she became a living conduit of culture. She softened the edges of American new money with old world polish, while injecting European society with a dose of new world vitality and extravagance. Their balls in New York became legendary not just for their cost, but for their sophisticated blend of American scale and European tradition. They set the trends that everyone else followed, from the cut of a dress to the arrangement of flowers on a table. They proved that style was more than fashion. It was a tool of diplomacy, a way to negotiate their complex position between two continents, and ultimately to craft a new hybrid identity that was entirely their own. Every engagement announcement sent a ripple through the newspapers like a major corporate merger hitting the wire. The society pages of the era, particularly in New York and London, did not merely report on these unions. They analyzed them with the cold scrutiny of a stock market report. A headline was never just about love. It was a bulletin on social capital. When the news broke that Miss Consuelo Vanderbilt would marry the Duke of Marlborough, the coverage focused relentlessly on the numbers. Columnists speculated on the exact sum of the dowry, itemized the value of the trousseau being assembled in Paris, and calculated the annual allowance that would follow her to England. It was less a wedding announcement and more a public prospectus for a high-yield bond. The heiress herself was transformed into a celebrity commodity. Her market value, a topic of open conversation in drawing rooms and newspaper columns alike. Was the Gilded girl's fortune sufficient to land a marquess? Did the Jerome family's connections add enough premium to secure a promising second son, like Lord Randolph Churchill. The press fed an insatiable public appetite for this real-life fairy tale, but one told in the language of ledgers and asset valuations. This constant spotlight turned the private strategy of the Wall Street wife advantage into a public spectacle, a serialized drama where every chapter was a new engagement, every ball a potential trading floor, and every dowry a headline figure that confirmed or adjusted a family's social standing. For the families involved, this media frenzy was a double-edged sword. It provided the ultimate validation, proof that their social climb was now front-page news. Yet it also stripped away any remaining pretense of romance, laying bare the transactional heart of these alliances for the whole world to see and judge. The society columnist became the most powerful broker of all, one whose pen could inflate a reputation or puncture an ambition with a single, sly phrase. The glittering facade of these transatlantic marriages could not withstand the seismic shifts of the 20th century. The Wall Street wife advantage, a strategy born of Gilded Age desperation and ambition, began to crumble in the aftermath of the First World War. That catastrophic conflict did more than redraw maps. It shattered the very foundations of the old world order that had made the title trade possible. Suddenly, the ancient lineages and grand estates seemed less like noble legacies and more like relics of a doomed past. The young American women who came of age in the Roaring '20s were a new breed, raised with the spirit of flappers, not fairy tales. They had watched their mothers and aunts endure lonely lives in drafty castles, and they wanted no part of that gilded sacrifice. For them, personal freedom and romantic love became non-negotiable demands, far outweighing the dusty prestige of a coronet. The transaction no longer made emotional sense. Why trade your liberty for a title in a society that was increasingly questioning the value of aristocracy itself? This generational shift in attitude was the first and perhaps most powerful crack in the system. The financial calculus of the merger also collapsed under the weight of new laws. In Britain, the government introduced devastatingly high death duties, taxes on inherited estates so punitive they could force the sale of a family's ancestral home to pay the bill. This meant that even the massive American dowry, which had once repaired a roof and cleared debts, was now fighting a losing battle against the taxman. The rescue was no longer permanent. It was merely a temporary stay of execution. An heiress's fortune could be swallowed whole by the treasury in a single generation, making the entire strategic sacrifice feel pointless. At the same time, the source of American wealth itself was changing. The great industrial fortunes that had funded the first wave of dollar princesses were being broken up by antitrust laws and redistributed through modern estate taxes. There were fewer fathers capable of, or willing to, write a single check for millions to buy a duke. The golden pipeline of capital was narrowing just as the European need for it was becoming insatiable. This convergence of social and financial pressures led to a predictable and dramatic outcome: a wave of divorces that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The women who had been traded as assets now used their remaining wealth and growing legal rights to buy back their freedom. The most famous case was Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough, whose story of coerced marriage had become a symbol of the era's heartlessness. In 1921, after years of a separate and miserable life, she finally secured a divorce. It was a global scandal, but for Consuelo, it was liberation. She later married for love, a French aviator and inventor, and lived a life of genuine happiness and purpose. Her divorce was a beacon, signaling that the contract could be broken. She was not alone. Many other dollar princesses followed suit, walking away from their titles and their unhappy bargains. They retreated to Paris, to New York, or to the south of France, using their independent incomes to build vibrant, self-directed lives far from the stifling protocols of the aristocracy. The grand transaction, once seen as the pinnacle of social strategy, was over. The world had changed too much. Titles had lost their magic. Love had gained its primacy, and money could no longer save a system that was economically doomed. The castles remained, some still funded by those original dowries, but the human cost had been tallied, and a generation of women decided the price was finally too high. They chose to reclaim their own narratives, leaving the gilded cages empty and the strategy itself as a fascinating, cautionary footnote in history. Yet, the echoes of their arranged lives still resonate in our culture today, in our obsession with royalty and our complex relationship with wealth and status. What can these stories of calculated mergers and costly freedoms teach us about the choices we make in the name of social advancement? The stone and mortar legacy of these marriages still towers over the landscape. While the Wall Street wife advantage was a human drama of strategy and sacrifice, its most enduring evidence is architectural, written in limestone, marble, and gilt. The colossal dowries did not just balance ledgers. They physically reshaped some of Europe's most iconic estates, saving them from ruin and dragging them into the modern age. Take Blenheim Palace, the Marlborough seat. Consuelo Vanderbilt's fortune did far more than pay off debts. It funded a complete technological overhaul of the massive building. Her dowry installed modern plumbing and heating systems for hundreds of rooms, replacing fireplaces and chamber pots with radiators and running water. It repaired the vast roof, restored the intricate woodwork in the staterooms, and revived the formal gardens designed by Capability Brown, which had grown wild and unkempt. In a very literal sense, an American industrial fortune rewired and replumbed a Baroque masterpiece, ensuring its survival as a functional home and a national treasure. The story repeated across England. Warwick Castle, another medieval giant teetering on financial collapse, was rescued by the Greville family money, wealth originating from American investments and marriages. The funds stabilized its ancient walls, restored its great hall, and preserved its armories for future generations. These were not cosmetic makeovers. They were full-scale historical preservations bankrolled by New World capital. The American heiress, often lonely within those walls, could at least walk through halls and gardens that existed because of her. But the architectural exchange was not a one-way street across the Atlantic. The same fortunes and the same hunger for unassailable status also built monumental palaces back in the United States. The Breakers, the Vanderbilt summer cottage in Newport, is the ultimate example. While Consuelo's dowry saved Blenheim, her father Cornelius Vanderbilt II used the family's railroad wealth to construct this 70-room Italian Renaissance-style mansion overlooking the Atlantic. It was a direct translation of European grandeur onto American soil, a declaration that the Vanderbilts could not only marry into aristocracy, they could build their own version of it. The Breakers, with its towering marble halls, ornate ceilings, and meticulous gardens, was a New World palace built with Old World inspiration. It stood as a permanent physical trophy of the family's social ascent, a symbol of the Gilded Age itself. This dual legacy is the strategy's lasting fingerprint. In Europe, American money preserved ancient stones from decay. In America, that same money piled new stones into breathtaking monuments of ambition. The landscape we inherit on both continents was fundamentally altered by the flow of capital that followed these brides. Their fortunes became the mortar that held history together and the foundation upon which new dreams were built. Yet the most profound legacy of these women was not written in stone, but in the lives they changed. For many a Wall Street wife, philanthropy became her true kingdom, a realm where her wealth and her hard-won title could wield genuine, transformative power. Trapped in marriages that offered prestige without partnership, these heiresses discovered a powerful outlet for their intelligence, ambition, and compassion, charitable work. With their independent allowances and vast resources, they moved beyond the decorative role of a society hostess to become serious benefactresses, founding institutions that still stand today. In an era before widespread government social programs, their private fortunes built public goods. A duchess could leverage her name to launch a fundraising campaign for a new hospital wing, her endorsement carrying the weight of centuries. She could use her position to champion causes that were radical for the time, such as public health initiatives for the poor or educational opportunities for women. This was influence with a moral engine, a way to convert the cold transaction of their marriage into tangible warmth for thousands. It allowed them to build a legacy that was entirely their own, separate from their husband's family name, a positive imprint on the world that no divorce or scandal could ever erase. For the first time, the Wall Street wife advantage was not just about social climbing or estate preservation. It was about channeling unprecedented capital toward human progress. Not every American heiress accepted the transatlantic bargain. For every young woman who sailed east toward a coronet, there was another who looked at that glittering cage and quietly closed the door. These were the daughters who said no, the ones who rejected the European title trade and chose a different path, often marrying fellow American new money or, more daringly, forging a life of independence. Their stories provide a powerful counterpoint to the main narrative, revealing a road not taken that offered more personal agency, even if it meant less seismic social impact. Consider Anita Stewart, a wealthy New York socialite and actress in the early 20th century. When she married a Russian prince, it seemed the classic dollar princess story was repeating itself. Yet the marriage quickly dissolved, and Anita returned to America, not to seek another title, but to reclaim her career and her autonomy. She eventually married an American businessman, living a life defined by her own choices rather than a centuries-old protocol. Her path was quieter on the world stage, but louder in terms of personal freedom. These women often exchanged the global prestige of a duchess title for the domestic power of being a Mrs. A store or a Mrs. Good. By marrying within their own American industrial class, they remained in a world they understood, surrounded by family and the familiar rhythms of New York and Newport. They became the undisputed queens of their own social circles, wielding immense influence over charity, fashion, and society within the United States. They did not have to navigate the labyrinthine etiquette of a foreign court or suffer the loneliness of being an ocean from home. Their power was more direct, their lives arguably more integrated and less performative. For some, the ultimate rejection of the bargain was to avoid marriage altogether. A small but significant number of heiresses used their fortunes to pursue education, travel, or artistic passions, becoming patrons, explorers, or intellectuals in their own right. They bought not a title, but time, the freedom to define themselves outside the institution of marriage entirely. This path was the rarest and most radical, a quiet declaration that a woman's worth was not solely as a bride, whether for a duke or a tycoon. So, did these women have an advantage? Their social impact was certainly less dramatic than a Vanderbilt saving Blenheim Palace or a Jerome mothering a prime minister. Their names are not etched into the peerage books of Europe. Yet, in terms of personal happiness and autonomy, their advantage was profound. They traded a pre-written script for the chance to author their own story, even if that story played out on a smaller, more personal stage. They escaped the gilded loneliness that consumed so many dollar princesses. This divergence forces us to ask a deeper question about the Wall Street wife strategy. Was the goal truly social power for the woman herself, or was it a form of dynastic branding for her family? For the heiress who said no, the answer was clear. Her life was not a vehicle for someone else's legacy. The gilded cage had a door, and a growing number of heiresses decided to break it open. Their rebellion did not come quietly. It arrived as a full-blown scandal that shook the foundations of high society on both sides of the Atlantic. The ultimate act of defiance was seeking a divorce. In an era when divorce was a social and legal earthquake, synonymous with ruin, for a duchess to sue for one was unthinkable. Yet, that is exactly what they began to do. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess of Marlborough, became the most famous symbol of this revolt. After enduring over 2 decades of a miserable, loveless marriage, she finally filed for divorce in 1921. The proceedings were a global media sensation, splashed across front pages from New York to London. Every detail of her coerced engagement, her mother's manipulation, and her husband's cold neglect was dragged into the light. The public, which had once devoured the fairy tale wedding announcements, now consumed the story of its spectacular collapse. For Consuelo, the divorce was not a defeat. It was a breathtaking reclamation of self. She used the very fortune that had purchased her title to buy her freedom back, securing a settlement that allowed her to live independently. Later, she married for love to a French aviator and found a happiness her gilded title had never provided. Her story sent a clear message to other trapped women. The contract could be broken. Divorce was the nuclear option, but rebellion took other, equally scandalous forms. Some heiresses simply refused to play their part as silent, decorative ornaments. They pursued public love affairs with artists, writers, or adventurers, flaunting relationships that prioritized passion over protocol. These affairs were not discreet whispers. They were loud, public declarations that a woman's heart was her own, not a clause in a marriage settlement. The newspapers gleefully reported on their travels with new companions, their appearances at parties without their husbands, and their general disregard for the rigid social rules they were supposed to uphold. Other women channeled their rebellion into the pursuit of their own interests with an intensity that seemed unseemly for a lady of title. They became serious art collectors, competitive horse breeders, or even amateur archaeologists, pouring their energy and wealth into passions that had nothing to do with their husband's legacy or social calendar. This, in its own way, was scandalous. It suggested a mind and a will that operated independently of the dynasty she was meant to serve. Each act of rebellion, whether a divorce, an affair, or a passionate vocation, exposed the same painful truth. The system had purchased compliance, but it could not guarantee it. The human spirit, even one raised in velvet and marble, could revolt against being treated as a transaction. These scandals revealed the deep cracks in the gilded facade. They proved that the Wall Street wife advantage was a one-sided bargain for the families and the estates. But for the woman living it, the cost could become too heavy to bear. Her rebellion was the price the old world paid for believing a person could be owned along with a title. The same strategy of trading capital for status never truly disappeared. It simply changed its costume. Today's global elite still engineers power marriages, but the currency is no longer just cash for a coronet. It is a complex blend of influence, branding, and technological clout. Think of the modern mergers that dominate headlines between Silicon Valley billionaires and entertainment superstars, or between old European aristocracy and the heirs of Asian industrial empires. The transaction is less about saving a castle from ruin and more about merging powerful brands into an unstoppable entity. When a tech founder marries a pop icon, they are not just uniting two people, they are merging massive audience reach with unprecedented capital and innovation cachet. It is a fusion of different kinds of power, creating a combined entity far more influential than the sum of its parts. The dowry is no longer a suitcase of cash for a duke. It is a stake in a unicorn startup, or the priceless asset of a global fan base. The title is not a hereditary peerage, but a position as a cultural sovereign, a name that opens every door from Wall Street to Hollywood. This is the Wall Street wife advantage, upgraded for the digital age. The goal remains strikingly similar: to secure an unassailable position in the highest tier of global society by combining assets that one side lacks. The old money European family might now seek an infusion of capital from a tech fortune to maintain its relevance and fund its philanthropic ventures, while a tech founder gains the patina of history and the sophisticated networks that centuries of privilege provide. It is a mutual rescue mission, just like before, but the vulnerabilities are different. The aristocracy fears a relevance in a fast-moving world, while the new money seeks legitimacy and a legacy that feels deeper than a stock price. The marriage becomes a public relations masterpiece, a living symbol of a balanced and powerful future. Yet, beneath this modern gloss, some of the same haunting questions remain. Is the person at the center of this merger an active partner or a strategic asset? Does this blending of empires grant the individuals more autonomy? Or does it create a new, even more gilded cage defined by brand management and public scrutiny? The players have changed, but the game of trading capital for social gravity continues on a global stage. The glittering ballrooms and whispered proposals of period dramas are a beautiful fiction. They sell us a fantasy where a titled gentleman falls helplessly in love with a spirited American heiress, her fortune a mere footnote to her charm. Reality was far more pragmatic and often far colder. The initial spark was rarely romantic attraction. It was a mutual audit. His family's lawyers discreetly verified the size of her fortune down to the last dollar, while her father's agents investigated the true extent of the estate's debts and the solidity of the title itself. The meetings were often arranged with the precision of a corporate interview, not a chance encounter at a ball. The courtship, if it could be called that, was a negotiation conducted in drawing rooms and through intermediaries, where topics like annual allowances and property settlements were discussed long before any talk of shared interests or affection. The language of the engagement was the language of finance, not poetry. Newspapers reported the merger of two great houses, not the union of two souls. This was not a love story that happened to involve money. It was a financial deal that happened to require a wedding ceremony. To believe otherwise is to misunderstand the fundamental engine of the Wall Street wife advantage. The goal was not personal happiness, but dynastic security and social transformation. Every element, from the guest list to the trousseau, was a public statement about power and solvency. The wedding portrait was a balance sheet in oils, a visual confirmation that the transaction had been successfully completed. The romantic ideal we cherish today was a luxury these unions could seldom afford at the start. The pressure of their strategic foundation was simply too great, the expectations too clearly quantified. So where does love fit into this calculated equation? Could it ever emerge from such sterile soil? Remarkably, sometimes it did, but its growth was a secondary and often fragile achievement. For every couple that lived in cold silence, there were pairs who, against all odds, forged a genuine partnership. Once the financial pressure was alleviated by the dowry and the social objectives were met, some couples discovered a mutual respect, a shared sense of duty, or even a deep affection that grew over years of shared life. They became allies in managing their complex world, united by the very legacy her money had preserved. This was love as a later addition, a fortunate dividend paid on a shrewd initial investment. It was not the foundation, but a piece of furniture brought into the house after the structure was already sound. For many others, however, the transaction remained just that, a lifelong business arrangement where cordial indifference was the best outcome one could hope for. The heart of the matter is this: judging these marriages by modern romantic standards misses the point entirely. They were not failures because they lacked love at the outset. They were successful because they achieved their explicit goals: rescuing an estate, elevating a family, and altering the course of history. The romance we project onto them is our own longing, a desire to see human feeling triumph over cold calculation. But in the gilded corridors where these lives unfolded, calculation was the primary architect, and feeling was a tenant that sometimes, not always, came to stay. The American fortune did more than repair stone walls. It rewrote the very DNA of Europe's oldest families. This genetic and dynastic impact is the Wall Street wife advantage written into history's family trees, a quiet revolution that revitalized, and in many cases, literally saved, aristocratic bloodlines from fading into obscurity. For centuries, these noble families had married within an extremely narrow pool, connecting cousin to cousin across the continent to keep titles and estates intact. This created a closed genetic loop, one that often concentrated not just wealth, but hereditary weaknesses and diminishing vitality. The infusion of American heiresses broke that loop wide open. They introduced robust new genetic material, along with a different kind of vitality, ambition, and often better health. The effect was profound, like introducing a strong, new hybrid seed into an over-cultivated garden. The children of these unions were, quite literally, a new breed. They inherited the ancient titles and historical legitimacy of their fathers, but they were also infused with the energetic, pragmatic, and often more resilient spirit of their American mothers. This hybrid vigor did not just produce healthier heirs, it produced heirs with a broader worldview. Growing up with a mother who crossed an ocean, who understood both the ruthless drive of industrial America and the subtle rituals of a European court, gave these children a unique perspective. They were bridge figures, equipped to navigate a changing world in ways their more insular ancestors could not. The most famous example is, of course, Sir Winston Churchill. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was the archetypal vibrant American force. From her, Winston inherited not just his famous half-American ancestry, but a certain fearless boldness, a rhetorical flair, and a relentless energy that defined his leadership. He was a product of this dynastic merger, a man whose very character seemed to blend old world tradition with new world resolve. But the influence extends far beyond one prime minister. Look at the descendants of other dollar princesses, and you find their blood woven through the fabric of modern European leadership, arts, and philanthropy. The daughters and granddaughters of these unions often became influential society hostesses, political figures, or noted philanthropists in their own right, carrying forward that transatlantic blend of capital and culture. In a very real sense, the American dowry purchased more than a title. It purchased a future. It secured the continuation of lineages that were financially and genetically exhausted. Without those infusions of new wealth and new blood, many of these great houses might have simply died out, their titles becoming extinct and their estates sold off for scrap. The heiress became the genetic lifeline, ensuring the family tree did not become a barren relic. This lasting impact forces a provocative question. Did the American heiress, so often seen as a purchased commodity, become the most vital savior of the very aristocracy that sought to commodify her? Her money saved the castle, but her bloodline saved the dynasty, leaving an indelible, living mark on history that still shapes the world today. Their stories are not just historical footnotes, they are masterclasses in leverage. Each Wall Street wife entered a game with a stacked deck, her value predetermined by her fortune. Yet within those rigid constraints, the most successful of these women performed a quiet alchemy, transforming their one undeniable asset, money, into other forms of power. They traded capital for a title, yes, but then used that title as a platform to build cultural influence, political access, and philanthropic legacy. This is the core lesson. Leverage is not about having unlimited options. It is about using the options you have with maximum strategic effect. These women had limited agency in choosing their path, but they demonstrated immense agency in navigating it once chosen. A Jenny Jerome could not refuse her marriage, but she could turn her drawing room into a political war room. A Consuelo Vanderbilt could not initially escape her gilded cage, but she could later use her wealth and story to advocate for women's rights and social reforms. They teach us that power is often a layered construction, built by converting one form of advantage into another, more durable kind. Their first asset was economic, the fortune. Their second was social, the title. Their third and most personal was the influence they carved out from the first two. This process of conversion is a timeless strategy in any rigid hierarchy. You use what you have to get, what you need to become what you want to be. But their lives also pose a haunting question about the price of that climb. What is the exchange rate between autonomy and status? For many, the bargain was brutally clear. They surrendered personal freedom and romantic choice for supreme social position and historical impact. They gained a crown but lost the right to choose their own companions, to speak with their natural voice, to live where and how they wished. This trade-off forces us to examine our own values. How much of our authentic selves would we be willing to mortgage for a guaranteed place at the pinnacle of our chosen world? The Wall Street wives operated in a system that viewed them as currency, yet their enduring legacy comes from the moments they ceased to be mere currency and became investors, directing the flow of capital and culture toward their own end. They understood a fundamental truth, that in a world obsessed with pedigree, the newest money could resurrect the oldest stones, and in doing so, the rescued could become the rescuer. Their advantage was purchased, but their power was earned. In the silent calculus of social ascent, their final lesson may be this: true leverage begins not with the assets you are given, but with the audacity to redefine their worth. Their legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of gold and thorns. The Wall Street wife advantage stands as one of history's most audacious social experiments, a breathtaking blend of ambition and calculation that reshaped nations. These women were both the products of a ruthless Gilded Age and the architects of a new transatlantic world. Their arranged marriages were not simple love stories, nor were they merely cold transactions. They were complex diplomatic missions, personal sacrifices, and financial rescues, all performed on the world's most glittering stage. In their pursuit of a title, they became unlikely preservationists, saving crumbling castles and ancient bloodlines with the very fortunes that had been snubbed by old money society. They built tangible bridges of stone and capital across the Atlantic, leaving behind the physical palaces we still visit today, from the restored grandeur of Blenheim to the opulent breakers in Newport. Yet their most profound bridge was cultural, merging American vitality with European tradition, creating a hybrid aristocracy that carried their influence into future generations, even producing a prime minister who would defy tyranny. They gained the world's highest social prestige, but the price was etched in personal loneliness, surrendered autonomy, and often a broken heart. They were saviors and prisoners, commodities and queens. Their stories force us to hold two contradictory truths at once: that a strategy can be both brutally exploitative and historically transformative, that a person can be both a pawn in a family's game and the most powerful piece on the board. So we are left with that final provocative question, echoing through the marble halls they funded. What is the true cost of buying your way into history? Is any crown, any legacy, worth the weight of a life you did not choose?